I grew up in a small town, the kind where there are no strangers and no secrets. I don't think I realized then that I had never felt true fear. Nothing exciting happened when your town's population was barely breaking 4 digits. The whole place was centered along a mile-long strip of road, which housed all convenience stores and a few restaurants. One of those restaurants just so happened to be a pizza parlor. It was nothing spectacular, but as a kid, it was worthy of excitement. At first, I would go with my parents, although over time, puberty and the ability to form my own opinions began to sour our relationship. But then I was old enough to begin to go with my friends whenever I wanted, feeling wise and world-weary at 14. Things were remarkably mundane in our community, and my friends and I usually had to find our own forms of entertainment. There's only so much enthusiasm you can have for wading the river that can run through our town. People love to swim in it, but I stopped going after a few years when I realized how dirty the water was. That's when we focused in on the door. It was a tiny thing tucked into the corner of the pizza parlor. Someone had eventually asked the owner of the place what it was, and he maintained that it was just a small storage room that they kept boxes and cleaning equipment in. The padlock on the door, he claimed, was just to make sure no one went inside and accidentally hurt themselves. It was a reasonable explanation, and no one really thought to question it. The summer after our freshman year in high school, my friends and I finally decided to do a little investigation of our own. We weren't really expecting to find anything. Honestly, the only reason we even considered it was because of that padlock. It wasn't one of those dinky little things you can find at any hardware store. It was heavy and industrious. Why would he need such a secure lock? What can I say? It's been a slow summer. So we commended our plan, and our objectives were simple. Find a way to get into the restaurant when no one was around, figure out a way into the storage room, and do a little digging out of our own. I think we just wanted to feel the thrill of doing something illicked for once. None of us were that worried about being caught, so convinced we were in our own invincibility. I was the quiet kid in the back of class who never volunteered answers, but always had the correct one when called upon. I kept to myself for the most part, and I'd never gotten into any amount of significant trouble in my life. My friends Jamie and Stefan were much louder and more energetic than I ever managed to be. Stefan and I had been best friends since kindergarten. When Jamie moved to town in 3rd grade, she caused quite the scandal. Her single-parent mom was a notorious alcoholic, and often skipped from job to job. We somehow became fast friends, and over time, the friendship between Stefan, Jamie, and I flourished. Together, we became a staple around the various town hangouts, and we never got up to too much trouble. By then, we'd already pulled off the classic parental disdirect 1,000 times. I told my parents I was spending the nights at Stefan's. Even though I'm a girl, they trusted his family and me. They knew Stefan was a brother to me, after having been friends for as long as we could remember. Jamie's mom usually didn't notice or care what she was up to, and she had confessed to me during one of her sleepovers that she had played a little experiment once and went camping in the woods behind her house. She said she stayed out there for 5 days, and when she went back to her house, her mom had never even noticed that she was gone. Stefan just had to tell his parents that we were staying over at my place, and we were set. We were so excited, thrilled with the idea of our disobedience. We reasoned that the only harm done would be the owner having to replace the lock. On nights where Stefan and I would manage to convince our parents to let all 3 of us stay over, we would laugh and plan late into the night about how we would deal with the wave of questions that would arise. In our minds, we felt like the grandest spies. When people would spectate what would happen, we would have broken into a place just to get to the storage closet, and we would have to maintain our expressions and act as if we knew nothing. We even planned out what we would do if we did find something. He might be very well hiding something valuable or even illegal back there. We decided if there was any sort of treasure, we would leave it be. If it ended up being something criminal that he was trying to hide, Stefan speculated, with Jamie maintaining that it would be a secret clone of the owner. Then we would go to a small police station and report it. We would be conquering heroes, and our misdeeds would be forgiven if we did discover anything of import. If only we knew. Finally, it was time for us to act out our plan. We had determined that the easiest way to get into the place after closing would be to find a way to stay inside past the nightly checks. Jamie had done a little reassurance mission and went to grab a late-night slice of pizza. She was the one who noticed that when the bored employee who had the bad luck of being on the closing shift would do the bathroom checks, they just looked under the stalls from the front of the room rather than actually going in and pushing the stall doors. Stefan was the one who figured out how to get past the lock. He found a pair of bolt cutters in his dad's shed that sliced through chains with ease. From there, it was a job to manage the details. I established how long we would wait in the stalls after closing. 2 hours, just to be safe. A few days before the night of our plan, I casually started a conversation with one of the employees at the restaurant, Charlie. He was a senior, and I knew he thought I was cute. I had been so nervous that he would think my questions about the nightly cleaning schedule were weird. But I framed it as if I was asking when he got off work. He bought it and told me that most of the cleaning was done in the morning. They never bothered to do much at night unless there was an obvious mess. I made sure we had supplies. Headlamps so that our hands would be free, some energy drinks and snacks so we would no doubt be tired after all the time doing nothing, and a watch to make sure we were keeping track of time. I was also the one who decided that we would get out through the back employee entrance. None of us expected our excursion to last more than an hour at most, and I didn't think the owner would find it too odd if an employee forgot to lock the door as they were leaving at night. We decided that we would head to the parlor at 8 p.m. From there, we would order some dinner and regale each other with rebellious stories for a couple hours, after which of us would head to the bathroom and stay there. Stefan went first, and after another 20 minutes, Jamie followed. By then, it was only half an hour until close, and I made sure to settle our bill and linger in the front entrance. Once the sole front employee headed back into the kitchen, I darted into the girls' restroom, making sure to catch the door as it closed so it wouldn't make a noise. I had a quick, whispered conversation with Jamie through the stall door before heading to the neighbor's stall so I can settle in for the wait. Cell phones weren't as a commonplace for teens back then, not in the town with as limited of a social calendar as ours, so you'd think we would have been easily bored with no entertainment. But this was our first time really, truly breaking the rules. Even waiting in the darkness for hours felt like an adventure of epic proportions, with the anticipation of what was to follow. Before we expected it, Stefan was pushing open the door to the room and asked in hushed tones if we were there. I almost fell over when I stepped down from the seat, the blood rushing into my legs all at once. But soon I was eagerly rushing out to pull Stefan and Jamie into a hug. I couldn't help laughing and exclaiming, Phase 1. Phase 1 of operation, pizza hideaway complete. Stefan got into the act, straightening up into an exaggerated military stance and snapping out a sloppy attitude. Ma'am, yes ma'am, commencing Phase 2. Jamie just laughed helplessly, clutching at my side trying to keep somewhat quiet. We were thrilled at the excess of our deception. Once we were all somewhat composed, we got our headlamps and went into the main lobby, carefully navigating the tables into the back, a curious hush falling over us. I think the sight of stacked chairs in the complete darkness of the restaurant finally made it start sinking in that we were really breaking the law. It didn't make us want to stop, but it gave us a sense of gravity. The fact that it was just about a silly little door that we mostly expected was just a storage room was irrelevant. It was about the rush it gave us. We finally made our way to the door. It was in the darkest corner of the very back of the restaurant, and unless we shined our light straight at it, the 3-foot-tall opening was indistinguishable from the wall. I sat my backpack and we sat in a little circle and downed the food and drinks I brought while joking quietly about what might be behind there. Our last moments to speculate. We were impatient to get started though, and only a few minutes passed before Stefan reached into my bag to get the bolt cutters. We decided that we would open up the lock while Jamie and I aimed our lights at the handle of the door to make sure we had a good light to work with. He struggled a little with fitting the blades into the tool, to the small space between the handle and the lock. And for a minute, Jamie and I cast nervous glances at each other, causing our lights to waver and Stefan to curse as he tried to get the right angle. Her worries were unfounded, however, and after a moment he managed to bear down with just the right pressure and snap the lock. We all stood there for a second, after the screech the scrap of metal on metal had caused. Luckily, or unluckily, as it would soon come to pass, it really was too late for anyone to be in this area, and no one came around banging on the doors and shouting about intruders. We felt safe enough to proceed after that. Since Stefan had been the one to break the lock, we actually decided him to be the honor of opening the door for the first time. He reached out and threaded the now broken padlock through the handle of the door, and reached back to give it to me. After he placed the lock into my backpack, I kicked it to the side. We were going to toss it into the middle of the river after we finished at the pizza parlor, and hopefully no one would be the wiser to a break-in for at least a few days. We all shared one last keyed-up look with each other, full of nerves and exhilaration, before we crouched down and watched as Stefan reached for the handle. He had to tug for a moment to get it to bulge, the door obviously seldom being opened. The miniature wooden entrance finally swung open on rusty hinges, and we peered forward in anticipation, only to let out a mutual groans of disappointment when our lights revealed nothing more than a small cement room with a low ceiling and a few scattered boxes. None of us wanted to look at each other. We had spent weeks planning this, and it would be a lie to say that there wasn't some small part of us that had been convinced that there had been something in there. With a scoff, Stefan kicked out and pushed the box to the side, which caused a small sack to topple over with a bang. The cloud of dust that resulted made us all start coughing. The old man who owned the place had been telling the truth after all. It really was just some musty little storage space. Giving another drawn-out sigh, I leaned forward and crawled out half into the space, a small box of 4 by 4 feet concrete, and began to haul the boxes back into place. That was when I noticed the breeze. For a second, I froze before I began to frantically move the boxes to the side in an attempt to find where it was coming from. I didn't stop until I managed to unearth a round metal door set into the floor, sealed with another padlock. I fell back in amazement, hardly noticing when I landed on my tailbone. I couldn't believe it. We had finally found something. My friends noticed what I was looking at. They too rushed forward, all of us squeezed into the overcrowded space and staring in awe. The strangely protected door was one thing, but hiding what seemed to be a trap door under an obvious ruse of boxes meant there had to be something down there. We began a whispered conversation at the new discovery. We hadn't expected that we would find to dig deeper than we already had. Stefan was eager to go forward. Obviously, there has to be something good down there. Why would this guy need to hide it behind 2 locks if it wasn't important? Jamie was more reserved, and I could tell the nerves were getting to her as her voice shook just slightly as she spoke. But why is it so dusty in here? I mean, if he actually had stuff that he cared about down there, wouldn't he, go down and check on it once in a while? It doesn't look anyone has been inside this room for years. I agreed with both of them. It was true. If something was hidden behind these many locks, it had to be something the owner didn't want other people to find. It was strange, though, that it was clearly neglected. However, we had come this far, and I wanted to know what was down there. It seemed pointless to stop now, so I tried to suggest a compromise. What if Stefan and I check out what's ever down there, and you can stay up here with this stuff and warn us in case anyone walks by the restaurant and notices something's up? We all knew no one was actually going to come by, but Jamie was relieved at this excuse, and Stefan just wanted to see what was down there. Once we had estimated the new plan and Stefan was once again armed with the bolt cutters, we moved forward. With the boxes shoved to either side of the room, he had just enough space to squeeze forward and work at the lock, an even more heavenly reinforced padlock that took him minutes to saw through. When he finally managed to remove the lock, he barely glanced back at us and reached down to heave open the door. When I saw it was hardly moving, I shoved my way past a few boxes and managed to get a hold of the handle. And with all of us pulling with all our strength we could muster, we were finally able to get it open. What greeted us was a pitch-black tunnel with the top of a ladder rug just visible in the darkness, and a rush of chilled air that held the faint, stagnant odor of stale pizza. Stefan and I both glanced at Jamie, and she gave us a nod. She was okay with us leaving her alone for a while. With that assurance, Stefan began the descent down the ladder, holding his headlamp in his hand and aiming it down so he could see the next rug to step down to. After he cleared the top foot of the tunnel, I followed suit, attempting to push down the tension that I could feel building in my shoulders. As he climbed the further down, the air began to cool, and soon I was shivering. Looking back, the tunnel must have only been 10 feet deep, but at the time, it had felt like 100. There was a brief drop at the end of the ladder, and Steph and I found ourselves in a cramped space, roughly 4 by 5 feet. I was short enough that I could stand up straight, but Stefan had a hunch slightly. That was when I noticed the door. It was set into the wall opposite of the ladder. The space had a curious darkness. I don't know if it was because we were so deep underground, but our lights scarcely reached a couple feet in front of us. It seemed to be made of the same concrete as the walls, with another padlock on the latch. Stefan and I shared an uneasy glance, and I could tell the situation was finally getting to him. Having 2 locks was peculiar, but the depth of the tunnel and the clearly rough-shod construction of the space was disquieting. If the owner never bothered to come down here, why was he so worried about security that he had to use 3 locks that was basically the same? Anyone who could get through the first 2 would obviously be able to get through the third. It was then that I began to question if it wasn't to prevent someone from getting in, but rather something from getting out. I wish that I erred on the side of caution and urged Stefan to leave things alone and head back up. I didn't, though. I couldn't quite manage to make myself believe that there was anything dangerous down there. I was so sure that things would be fine. Nothing ever happened in this town. Stefan had brought the bolt cutters down with him, and I helped shine the light on the lock as we went down to break it. When it clanged down to the ground, he and I shared a fleeting look before he braced himself and began pulling open the door. It had to be heavy, since it was at least 5 inches thick. It also must have been designed to be relatively soundproof. When Stefan had succeeded in opening it wide enough that we'd be able to slip through, I started noticing the noises. A curious, muffled, scratching sound. The darkness in front of us was just as complete as it was in the entryway, and as we continued to cautiously edge forward, I reached out to grab Stefan's hand. As illogical as it felt, I was terrified that we would lose ourselves in the pitch black if we got so much as 3 feet from each other. As we shuffled forward, I noticed the ground had an occasional crack that allowed a peek at the damp earth below. Even more curious were the small light-colored fragments that were at the edges of the breaks in the cement. I tugged Stefan's hand to indicate we should stop, and bent down to pick one up. I was so surprised that I didn't scream when I realized what I was holding. It was a piece of a broken fingernail. I think I was in shock, because all I did was calmly bring it closer to my face. With the improved light, I could see the hint of blood at the edges where it must have broken into the nail bed. Stefan was hushed and impatient. He didn't know what I was holding yet. Come on, we should keep looking around. It was the first time either of us had spoken since we had gotten down here, and that's when I realized the absence of the scratching sound. Have you ever noticed when a sound fades into the background? It can be something that puts you on edge. But if you hear it consistently enough, you stop keeping track of it. Well, the scratching had worried me. It had continued even after we entered the room. And after a couple minutes of nothing happening, I relaxed into it. The scratching stopped as soon as Stefan spoke. A sudden, overpowering sense of dread came over me, and I struggled to respond. Fingernail, it's a fingernail! Stefan, we have to leave. We have to go right now. I could tell he was confused. What are you talking about? By then my alarm was so great that I didn't want to risk lingering to explain it to him. Instead, I turned back towards where the entrance was and began pulling him towards me with all my strength. I caused him to crash into my back when I came to an abrupt stop, unable to control my trembling. Well, the door was too far away for my light to clearly illuminate the space. I could just make out the hunched, skeletal figure standing in front of it. After Stefan pulled away from my back, he began to protest. "What the hell are you?" I could tell the instant he followed the direction of my light was pointed and saw the figure in the doorway. Only at his voice it had scuttled forward. That's when I noticed it was moving on all fours. With the ceiling so low, there was no other way to move quickly. The scratching noise from before started up as it had moved, although it came to an abrupt stop after Stefan stopped speaking. At that point, it was only 5 feet or so in front of us, and had come close enough that I could begin to make out particulars of its appearance, or rather, her appearance. This close, I could see that it was a woman. Her back was bizarrely curved and sickeningly lunched to her spine that was no doubt caused by the constant hunch she'd been adapting to the space. She was so thin that I could hardly bear to look at her torso, the jutting of her bones painfully stretching her skin. It lent a spiny nature to her limbs, which led down to a long, jaggedly broken finger and toenails, no doubt the source of the scratching noise. At a glance at her face, I no longer wondered why she only moved forward when we spoke. She was blind. Her eyes had an odd, milky quality to them, seeming huge and bulging against the gaunt concave of her cheekbones. Between the lank strands of hair that stretched down to her hips, frayed and thin, I could make out the malins that twisted her thin mouth, showing a hint of yellowed, rotten teeth. She was nude, although her skin seemed like a suit, given how it hung off of her, covered in the dirt of walls and the scars that gouged at her upper arms and thighs. Exactly where you might scratch yourself where you were holding your arms to your chest or hunched in a fetal position. In that moment, I'd never felt more of an animal reduced solely to fight or flight instinct. My mind was static. When I noticed an equally panicked-looking Stefan opening his mouth, I made sure to forcefully clamp down on his hand, shaking my head when he glanced at me, trying to take my eyes off of the woman still crouched in front of us, producing a small raspy noise every time she took a breath. I put my hand carefully over my mouth, trying to not rustle my shirt. After I left it there for a moment, I pointed at my eyes, then carefully at my ears. She only knew where we were because we had been making plenty of sound moving about the room, and then later speaking. When Stefan first spoke, that was when she had finally paid full attention to us. Who knew how long it had been since she had last heard a human voice? Even without us speaking, she cautiously moved forward. It was a slower lurch and slightly uneven. I knew she would manage to bump into us eventually, and I frantically glanced around to try to figure out how to get us out. I had the idea that maybe if Stefan and I split up, if we were both yelling, perhaps we could distort her with the volume of our voices. Gesturing at him, I mimicked yelling and used my fingers to make a running movement, pointing him in one direction. I was trying my hardest to let him know what I was thinking. The inherent sense of danger was unbearable, and I wished I could prepare myself after Stefan got what I was trying to say. She was only moving closer, though, so I put 3 fingers trying to ignore my shaking of my hand. By this point, the woman was only 2 feet away, and I knew if she stretched out her arm, she would be able to grab one of us. I quickly put down one finger, then the other, and with the final glance at Stefan, I put down the last one and was off like a shot. We both began to shout. Mostly I was screaming, letting out the fear and tension that had been building up ever since we entered the room. I ran at a diagonal towards the back of the room, while Stefan shot straight to the side. As I ran, I noticed more details, things that to this day I wish I could forget. In one corner, a pile of ratty blankets, the smell so rancid that I brought involuntary tears to my eyes. It was positioned right below an opening in the ceiling that went straight up, too small for any human to fit through. As I looped back towards the entrance, I almost stepped into a large pile that went straight down into the earth. More than the blankets, the smell was indescribable. Quickly veering to the side, I tried to catch sight of Stefan. Instead, I saw that the woman was behind me. Although far enough back, I could tell our plan was working. The space was large enough that our yells echoed, and even though I was developing a headache at the overwhelming noise, I turned towards the doorway and tried not to glance at the walls. at the writing and drawing scratched into them, indistant and bloodied. That's when I noticed Jamie. She must have heard her yelling. We were being so loud that it would have been impossible for her not to have. She stepped into the room and was standing to the side of the door, bracing herself on the wall much like we had when we first entered. Our headlamps were dim enough that she could probably only make out the lights coming towards her. I began yelling at her rather than screaming my head off in fear. "Get out! Run! Run, Jamie!" Stefan shot past me and I saw him make it through the door and reach the ladder, looking back at us with a frantic expression on his face. As I reached the entrance, I snagged Jamie's sleeve and started trying to pull her towards the door. At this point, Stefan and I had stopped yelling. It would only give us away now. I tried to hold up my finger in a shushing gesture, but Jamie had been the most afraid out of all of us. Fear froze me, but it made her frantic, talkative. She didn't realize the significance of my gesture, but I can't say I blame her after the scene she walked into. In a damning motion, she opened her mouth to speak. "Are you guys okay? I waited, but then I heard you guys yelling and..." She was abruptly cut off and I lost my grip on her, and she pulled back into the room, a skeletal hand with ragged fingernails gripping her throat and piercing it as it pulled her down. I would like to say I would have gone back for her, would have fought. After all, the woman could have been stronger than all three of us combined. Only my light was focused straight at Jamie as she fell backwards, and I heard the wet thunk of her head struck at the concrete at the right angle. Something about that sound and how her head looked was so terribly wrong that I didn't have a moment's doubt that she was dead. Stefan and I looked at each other before frantically trying to scramble up the ladder. I didn't dare glance back. It had been enough to see my friend dead the once, to see the woman crouching over her, bent so low her nose was touching Jamie's forehead. We managed to make it to the top, and after I pulled myself out of the tunnel, Stefan slammed the door shut. It had been so heavy that I doubted the woman would ever be able to push it up on her own. I grabbed my backpack as we rushed past, and without speaking, we both ran towards the employee door through the kitchen. I can't say how long we ran, but it had been at least a mile. We reached the end of our town's limits and hesitated at the edge of the forest, panting and leaning over each other. I was crying, but hadn't been aware of it before then. Stefan's face was blank. I had never seen him so empty of emotions. And as I clutched at him, he remained still, staring into the woods. "What are we going to do, Stefan? What the fuck was that? She's dead. Oh God, she's dead." I began to sob, and in a mechanical motion, Stefan put an arm around my shoulders. Eventually, he started walking back towards town, and we made our way to the only payphone. I kept furiously looking around to make sure the area was clear, but Stefan hadn't moved his eyes from the ground since he had started walking. I checked my watch. It had only been 20 minutes since we opened the first miniature wooden door. I handed Stefan a few quarters and he proceeded to dial 911. He didn't sound like himself when he spoke. It wasn't just that he was pitching his voice lower. It also sounded uncharacteristic, deadened. "Someone's dead at Odin's Pizza Parlor. Look in the back." That's all he said before he hung up. I was in a daze. I had cried more in the last 10 minutes than I had ever had before in my life. It was that emotional shock that led me to following Stefan around as he proceeded to go back to his house, sneaking into his bedroom window, as we had ever since we were kids. But he wasn't the same. Neither of us were. We held a muted conversation, him in a sleeping bag next to the bed he always let me have when I stayed over. The ceiling kept blurring above my eyes, and eventually kept them shut so I couldn't tell that I was crying. Stefan did most of the talking. It was all I could do not to scream. We didn't discuss our plans with anybody, and other than the bolt cutters, we didn't leave anything behind. They'll probably figure out they're my dad's, but they just assume she stole them from my house last time she was there. We'll go downstairs in the morning and convince my parents that yours were arguing, so we came over here to stay the night. I didn't want to bother them since they were already asleep. Nothing ever happens in this town. They want to say it's solved as soon as possible. You know how they cut corners. They being the police. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. There were plenty of things our local law enforcement ignored in favor of keeping the town's peace. Besides, I had a feeling that whatever was up with that woman we had found was going to be far bigger news than the events that led up to her being discovered. Not that I wanted to admit it at the time. Even the thought of lying, of shifting all the blame to Jamie, made bile rise in the back of my throat. In a way, though, it was comforting to have Stefan take charge in the moment. I didn't say a word, and eventually I heard rustling as Stefan shifted in his sleeping bag. If we both stick to that, we'll be fine. You'll see. Jamie wouldn't have wanted all of us to get in trouble. What's done is done. It disgusted me, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. Eventually I managed to fall asleep, but it was fitful. When morning finally came, we went downstairs and followed through what Stefan had told me to say. His parents took it in stride. Mine were known to have their troubles, so they weren't surprised. It told a lie that we had given my parents into something believable, and Jamie hadn't told her mother anything at all. It took a while for the details to filter through to us. We didn't bother to leave Stefan's house for the rest of the day, and his parents were out of work for most of it. When they came back, their faces were drawn and pale as they pulled both of us aside to sit on the couch. With terribly kind faces, they told us how Jamie's body had been found, their kindness grating on me as I contemplated my own deceit. I didn't have to fake the tears that ran down my face. My sorrow was unrelenting. Over the next few weeks, we managed to collect the particulars of what had happened. This was the juiciest bit of gossip that our town had had for decades. In fact, the last time anything interesting had happened was when Odio's wife had packed up a bag and left him and the 3 children one day with no word. It had been such a tragedy, abandoning her family like that. In a community like this, people didn't leave each other when they were unhappy. They just stewed in their own misery. Otto had apparently found a different solution. He was nearly in his 60s and had built his pizza parlor in our small town nearly 30 years ago. It had been relatively successful, with it being our only pizza place. So successful that he had to close it for 2 months in the mid-90s in order to do a full renovation. His wife had left him only a year after the unveiling. Only it turns out, she didn't leave. Instead, she found herself placed in the tomb that would be her home for the next 2 decades. Over time, as the shock began to wear off, police started to release more information on the crime, and the gossips in the town started to reveal what they remembered. There was a part of the renovation that Otto had not revealed to the workers he was paying. A small section of the restaurant in the back that he had pardoned off. Before he went into the restaurant business, he briefly worked in construction, idly traveling around the United States and stretching his wings after escaping from suffocating smallness of the town that he lived in for his entire life. After a few years, he returned in order to open up his own pizza place, claiming the receipts came down to his family. He married his childhood sweetheart, Melinda, and quickly fathered 3 boys. It would have been an ideal situation if he and Melinda actually liked each other. Everyone knew they had the most terrible screaming matches with each other, but as the fascinated and vile housewives would tell it, they would never get a divorce. It wasn't how things were done. And Otto knew it. Opinions can change in an instant in a place like this, and he knew that if he had a long, bitter divorce, Melinda would get the sympathy of the town. So when the construction workers would leave for the night, he would return to the restaurant and take advantage of the equipment they had left behind in order to build his own little hideaway. He dug beneath the foundation and hollowed out a roughly constructed room. He even made a clever little vent in the ceiling, too narrow to ever crawl through. It led into his office, and he had a soundproof covering that hid it from view. Once a day, he would drop the leftover pizza that was made down the hole along with the bottled water. He made sure to put it in a wide pipe that went deep enough that it tunneled into a local water bed, washing away any debris that went down it. After all this time, I'm so grateful I stopped going swimming in that river. And so that's how she lived for over 20 years, slowly going blind and mad in complete isolation. He had no need to go down to see her. His conscience made him drop down just enough food and water to allow her to survive. And out of an inexplicable and instinctive urge to stay alive, she did. Seeing as he made sure to soundproof every possible entrance to the structure, I had no doubt that Stefan's voice was the first she had heard since she had heard Otto threatening her into a small slatting room. It's unlikely she could have imagined what he was planning to do. It all worked exactly as he had planned, and he enjoyed continuing success and the love of his sons for many years. Really, who would want to go to the effort of exploring a small storage closet that held nothing but some old boxes and cleaning supplies? Even knowing that Melinda might have continued to suffer for what might have been decades to come if we hadn't have hatched the insane plan made out of boredom and curiosity of youth, I would still take it back in an instant if I could have Jamie back. Melinda died of a heart attack shortly after she was taken into the paramedics' custody. I can't blame her. I think she held on to that miserable life just long enough to know she had escaped. Everything in town settled after a while. Otto was sentenced to 50 years, a death penalty for a man of his age, and his sons moved out of town and under a shroud of shame and grief that followed them. The basement was filled with cement, and the pizza parlor was renovated into an Olive Garden, the first chain restaurant to ever grace our town. No one bothered to question why Jamie was there by herself, or any of the discrepancies about the break-in. Her mom was a town disgrace, and Jamie's death only fueled her drinking. It was easy to reduce it to the simple tragedy of a young girl from a broken home acting out. Stefan and I were never the same. We held on for a few months out of habit, but we never spoke about what had happened. And I couldn't stomach the way he had shut himself off from the events that night. But I grieved. Oh God, I grieved. There were some days I felt as if I could hardly breathe, as if the weight of what we had done would crush me. My parents took me to a doctor, tried to get me on medication. Depression, they said. Potentially an eating disorder. Truthfully, I couldn't eat without thinking of that horrible pit, with the event that would drop down discarded food once a day. I begged my parents to move after what had happened. Finally, after months of seeing me slowly wither and turn on myself, they agreed. We left quietly 4 months after the incident. I never said goodbye to Stefan. I don't know what he would have said. Eventually, even I couldn't resist the drag of time, and before I realized it, I had begun to move on. One day I found myself smiling, and from there, it became easier every day. I never forgot Jamie, and to this day, I am so law-abiding that my friends make fun of me for it. Over time, I started to forgive myself. We all made the agreement to explore what was in that little pizza parlor hideaway that night, and Jamie was a victim of chance and stupidity. Melinda could have grabbed any of us. I don't think she was doing it out of any real sense of hatred for us. I think she just had so long to stew in silence and isolation that all she had left was hatred. You might wonder why I'm finally speaking out after all this time. Even though it was 10 years ago, I could still come into quite a bit of trouble, and it is without a doubt the most shameful experience of my life. You see, I had to come to peace with what had happened that night. I dragged myself kicking and screaming into acceptance. What I have learned changed all of that. I had never looked into the details of what had happened that night, seeing as I was there to experience it firsthand. Last night, I finally felt strong enough to revisit the event. I decided, out of morbid curiosity, that I would start reading some of the backlogs from our town's newspaper. I knew it would be picking at a healed wound, and yet I couldn't talk myself out of it. That's when I learned a detail that I hadn't been privy to before. It took a long time for police to release the information. It was on the last page of the town's small newspaper on the anniversary of the tragic break-in. They must have thought the timing was apt. In a town as small as that, it can take quite a while for police to respond to a call. In this case, 45 minutes. All we had known at the time was that Jamie had been found dead. This didn't surprise me, as I had seen her die. Or so I thought. She must have been dazed for a time. In fact, the coroner estimated that she'd been awake and alive for at least 20 minutes before she finally succumbed to her injuries. Only minutes before police arrived. Cause of death was massive blood loss, from not only a head wound, from the numerous severed tears found on her body. Melinda had been scratching at that room for decades. I imagine she might have had enough of a frame of mind to try the trapdoor. Without leverage, though, it would have been impossible for her to open. We had locked her in. She must have started yelling as soon as she woke up in that cold, terrifying hideaway. The yells must have turned to screams when Melinda came to investigate the noise. The thing is, I don't think she was ever aware of what she was doing. The screaming must have been awfully disorienting after decades of silence. In the end, the only defense Melinda had left were her fingernails.